my name is Alexander. I'm an undergraduate here at FAU. I'm in my senior year in economics.
My name is Kareem and I'm a software developer.
Where did you come all the way from, by the way?
Orlando.
Nice.
My name is Lindsey. I'm a senior getting my undergraduate degree.
In what?
That's a great question. But I'm a senior.
Neuroscience.
Neuroscience. Yeah.
The name G.A.R.I stands for General Applications for Research and Innovation.
Click. So the overview of what we're going to be talking about is quantitative analysis, some neuroscience models we looked into, and glucose readings. And the biggest question, kind of what helped us combine finance and neuroscience, is what do finance and neuroscience have in common? Equations. That's like the main thing that we kind of relate. And so the initial approach for what we started was to think unconventionally. And so to begin, how did we start here? Is we started exploring the intersection of two disciplines, and we looked at these specific models, and Lindsey can talk about the two on the left.
Yeah, so Hodgkin's-Huxley model as well as the Fitzhugh-Nagumo model are both prototypes of excitable systems. So they are ways to describe the behavior of action potentials in neurons, but because they can, but they can also be generalized, right? So Fitzhugh-Nagumo is a simplification of the Hodgkin's-Huxley, and so we used that to try and model systems of finance.
And then, so stochastic volatility model is a way to use random normal probability distribution to kind of look at the prices of stocks to understand the volatility of that stock. And the exponential weighted moving average is similar to that. And basically what you're doing is you're looking at the moving averages of the stock over time in time series data to understand the volatility of that stock.
Alright, so one of the things that I was looking into, given that this is a hackathon and it's an opportunity to try a lot of unconventional things that may or may not work, was introduced to the Fitzhugh-Nagumo model of neuron activation. Here we can see the voltage of a neuron, which starts off at a resting state, and then given an input from another neuron, goes up and then oscillates down to a rest state. First thing we were thinking to do was to use this to model stock prices. The problem with that was that there is no, the concept of a price, well actually, we were talking about exercising options, and there is no analogy with exercising a stock option to the result of a voltage. So after that, one thing I noticed during the hackathon was when I looked at my glucose readings as a type 1 diabetic, because of lack of movement and a lot of sugary food available, it was very volatile. It would just jump up and down like crazy. So I thought maybe we could use some of the equations for market volatility to predict glucose volatility. Unfortunately, the connection between prices and glucose is very, very weak, and eventually that didn't go anywhere. After that, we tried using Fitzhugh-Nagumo for calculating the dose of insulin that a diabetic needs, basically expanding on that idea a little bit. Normally diabetics take into account the carbohydrates in the food that they eat. They multiply that, no, they divide that by their carb to insulin ratio, which gives them the dose that they need. We thought we may be able to try using this to calculate that glucose dosage instead. Unfortunately, the problem was that because this is a function of time and the dose of glucose is not a function of time, there wasn't any connection there either. So earlier today, the last thing that I thought about and tried was using Fitzhugh-Nagumo to model the actual glucose spike. If we have a marker anywhere here, we can draw that out. Here we have time, and here we have glucose. There's generally a range that you want to be in, and when you eat something, you take the insulin. What happens is the carbs from the food cause your glucose to go up, and then eventually the insulin starts working and brings it hopefully back down to a good level. What you want to avoid is going really up above that good range, or going up and then normalizing above the range. We thought there might be some similarity here, and that's what I ended up modeling down here. There were quite a few adjustments, such as, for example, here we're talking about milliseconds, whereas here we're talking about essentially hours. So from 8 p.m. to 12 p.m., for example. Fortunately, I wasn't able to actually get that curve going. We tried to basically create analogies for some of the parameters in this equation. Some of the parameters in there are, for example, the previous voltage, which in this case would have been the previous glucose. The resistance can possibly be modeled by, I believe I had here the regular glucose production of a person. Your body always needs glucose in order to function. Other than that, there is also that recovery variable, which helps it oscillate back. That could be modeled possibly by using basal insulin, which you take and it works for 24 hours. Unfortunately though, it looks like the concepts just aren't related enough to actually get a proper curve going and approximate it with the Fitzhugh-Nagumo model.
Pretty cool. Yeah, so that was something we did after the fact. We kind of found what we were getting with the finance data. And what we were getting with the finance data was, as we were testing things out, so the green line, the blue line is a historic volatility, so it's already recorded. Those are actual volatility within that stock. And the green line is basically using the weighted moving average of that volatility. And so that's actually what they do in quantitative analysis. And then the orange line is the Fitzhugh-Nagumo model. And so we try to find correlation between them, and there was difficulty in finding correlation within the financial data sets. We also tried combining the equations to create like hybrid forms of the equations to see what could happen. Over time, we kind of just found that we had to think inversely in terms of what equations could we use to kind of solve another problem, and that's how we landed with thinking about glucose and how we could solve looking at insulin levels for someone who has various rates of glucose levels. How can they measure how much insulin they need or don't need? That's a problem that we found that he was running into. So it would help him to understand how much insulin he would need given what food he ate that given day. And so we were just kind of moving forward after that. And so we found this didn't prove reasonable results because as we're looking at two interdisciplinary subjects, the equations are related to each subject. So when you try to combine these things, it makes it more difficult to find correlation. And so we can move to the next slide. This is how we implemented the volatility. Instead, as he mentioned, one was looking at voltage and the other one's looking at volatility. So we replaced voltage for volatility in the equation, and this was used in the financial data sets, and that's similar to how it came out with using stochasticity. So it's similar to how the Fitzhugh model kind of performs, but it doesn't necessarily draw 100% correlation to what's happening.
So I also just wanted to add about how differently I think about these sorts of problems since I came in here. I did not know what this was when I came in here. My professor told me about 4 hours before this started on Friday to show up, so I did. But I have learned a lot of new ways of thinking about problems, as well as like the importance of thinking about things in an abstract way to combine different subjects together and to think about things in different lights, and how that can contribute then to new innovations and improvements. And I think one of the sort of light bulbs in my head was when I was talking about, or when we were having a conversation about annealing being applied to cognition. Pull this up, this like a, yeah.
Just click on it.
Oh, never. So, with regards to annealing, right? Annealing is generally a concept that's used in materials science, right? So, you heat something up really quickly and you cool it down slowly so that it doesn't break, right? I find it so interesting that we can apply this to studies of the brain and to cognition and then model certain ideas in neuroscience after it. There was a specific, yes, so I also studied way back a little bit about the Metropolis Hastings algorithm and how that can be applied to Monte Carlo integration. And so it all ties back into my math background. So all of these things combining together, I really enjoy learning about how everything is connected, and I'm looking forward to learning more about the connections between things and how to think abstractly about certain concepts. So I don't remember which one is the slide that is it here?
It's like F5 or something.
Click the
F5?
Slideshow.
Okay.
Cool, yeah, so it was more so kind of thinking about how could we think abstractly and kind of involve different fields together. If you click that link, we can show you some of the code that was using the financial data sets. Okay, so, yeah, that's okay, but I showed you guys part of the code kind of from when we used the Fitzhugh model, and yeah, that's kind of to wrap things up. It was really about taking interdisciplinary approaches to solve different problems. What I really found interesting was the insulin problem, where we found we could actually use these equations to kind of probably help someone measure how much insulin they might need, and that's for diabetics. So
Well, we didn't actually compute that.
yeah, we couldn't figure it out, but it was a potential problem we found that if we solved it, it could actually help people. So just taking these approaches, and how you solve these problems. And I think that's it.
Awesome.
Fantastic.
Questions, round one.
So in your first attempt, you tried to model or to try to compare like stock prices or option prices to voltages. So voltage is like a relative quantity, so like between two different points. Did you try to like look at different like change in price instead of like absolute price?
No. The voltage curve simply shows it to us at just one point of time. I'm not sure how that would look on a graph. If we were to plot the change.
So like change in price from one day to another would be like based at 0, and it could go up and down. Like maybe that would track more closely since that's like a relative quantity instead of an absolute quantity.
It's possible. Although I guess one of the things though is that the Fitzhugh model requires several different parameters, and we have to find analogies to all of them. So we have to find analogies to the previous voltage, which could have been the previous change of price. We have to find an analogy for the sodium recovery, which I don't think really exists. There isn't really a normalizing factor that puts a stock price to a certain price. It really depends on a lot of market dynamics. And then resistance, I don't think there would be any parameter in a stock price that we could create an analogy for that.
Although there might be research that we could do to find parameters that work for these and then to apply those to the Fitzhugh model and develop something that could work. It probably just takes a bit more research than we had time for, seeing as we were all from different disciplines and didn't really know how to coordinate. But with more time, I think we probably could have found a solution.
Well, me personally, I probably wouldn't have gone down that route because I don't see the parameters being approximated in any way in a market environment. The last one that I was doing, that one probably would have the most hope because I was able to find some analogies to all the parameters. So that's what I would have gone with if I were to continue. But it is a good question, and yeah, that would be another thing to try. Although, given that we can't approximate all the parameters, I don't think it would really matter that much.
Last question.
Up front there.
Yeah, I had a question. So interesting. When you went with trying to model the prices of an option, is there a specific reason you didn't use, for example, the Black-Scholes equation? Because that could better approximate, you know, for example, various variables. So
What equation?
the Black-Scholes equation used to evaluate option prices.
Yeah,
That being
so-
said,
Yeah, that is.
that being said, one of the factors that works within the Black-Scholes equation is, for example, theta, right? And the closer you get to execution price, or the execution time for an option, theta decreases, right? And that makes me think, potentially in relation to the insulin graphs that you've drawn, right? As time goes on, more or less the variables balance out, maybe that could capture the reduction of glucose in your blood towards
Could
kind
you
of
repeat what theta does again?
What is it?
Could you repeat what
Theta
does in Black-Scholes?
theta is one of the variables involved in the Black-Scholes equation that captures time to the strike price, or like the strike time, right? So like options have an expiration date, right? And the closer you get to the expiration date, the smaller the theta gets, right? And the smaller the theta gets, the lower the price of the option, right? So that's one of the variables involved in the Black-Scholes equation for evaluating options. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, given all those variables that are involved, I don't remember the Greeks off the top of my head, right? I didn't do options trading for the last 3 years, but for a while though, if you calculated the variables, right, you could more or less derive and model the price of an option over time. And what you would find is that it would in some sense resemble some of the spikes and curves that you find with glucose. So maybe something to consider, you know, further in subsequent research.
Yeah, one thing that I would probably, that may be an issue with that, is that sometimes what happens is that insulin doesn't necessarily expire per se. Sometimes due to inactivity, it simply stays in the system until you have that activity, which is a trigger for it to actually start working. So it doesn't have a really set expiration date per se. It really depends on when the person starts having activity. So it can be hard to predict when it would come down.
Sure, but I'm sure, you know, given more variables, you could model that as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. We did use the Black-Scholes model to measure the Fitzhugh model, or the Hodgkin-Huxley model,
Yeah.
with options, and we did find correlation there. We just didn't mention it because it was a lot of like alternating strategies that we
Yeah.
had to test out. So once we kind of got there, we moved on to the Fitzhughs and kind of decided to move from there because it was a much more broader equation. The Hodgkin-Huxley was looking at sodium and potassium when things get released on neurons.
Yeah.
And so we needed a broader equation, so Professor Hahn introduced us to the Fitzhugh model there. And when we integrated that, we found still there was a little bit less correlation. However, we did not do that where we looked at glucose levels and Black-Scholes together. But that would have been a good thing to do.
Last thing I would add is that we couldn't find any analogy to a strike price in glucose. Any other question? Yep.
Yeah, mine is more a comment than a question, but you started your presentation and you enumerated this didn't work, this didn't work, this didn't work, this didn't work. I admire that. That is science, telling us what doesn't work. But mostly I'm struck by the fact that you're such an interdisciplinary team. We have an engineer, a scientist, and an economist, which reminds me of the great book, The Medici Effect, that asserts that all innovation is only from interdisciplinary people or teams, because you can see things from your past experience that other people can't see. So this is a good example of a hackathon team, in my opinion.
Do you have any good examples from history that you like in interdisciplinary leading to great ideas?
Well, for example, you know, if somebody is a doctor, a working doctor, and then they move over into, you know, computer technology, they can see things where there's need in the medical field that software engineers, electrical engineers have no idea. So that's the model that I use to explain the why of being interdisciplinary. But to anyone you know that's a jack of all trades, these are the people who are generally found near innovation and different ways of doing things. People who have a lot more to draw from in their experience.
Correct.
Great. Let's
Great
thank our
job.
speakers again.
Awesome.